Welcome to session 11 of a lecture on international political economy, in which we will discuss the ecology of the international political economy. More specifically, we'll discuss the question whether we need green growth or degrowth in order to deal with global warming. In the bigger picture, we're nearing the end of the whole lecture now. This is the second to last proper lecture session. Today's session will only have two parts. The first part is shorter, the second part is longer. In the first part, I'll discuss different areas in which the international political economy has something to do with the natural environment. In the second part, I'll discuss global warming more specifically and discuss it from a political economy perspective. So first, let's look at the relation between economic growth and the natural environment. I have shown you this picture here on my right a couple of times now. What I did not show you in this picture, what I was tacitly presupposing as much of the research on political economy did for decades or centuries, is that capitalist production also needs a natural environment surrounding it. More specifically, capital production cannot exist without certain, if you will, inputs from the natural environment. Among these are that there has to be the possibility of human life. Otherwise, we wouldn't have workers being able to perform the labor in capitalism. We also wouldn't have consumers or investors for that matter. So we need to have conditions under which human life is possible. Then we also need natural resources for capitalism in general. We can probably do without most individual resources, but in general, we cannot do without resources in general. Then we always need usable land. So any kind of capitalist production also always takes place in a certain location, and these locations have to exist. And while there can be capitalism in the desert, there probably couldn't be capitalism if all there was desert. And finally, also there shouldn't be too many natural disasters, because otherwise the whole stable political and social framework that capitalism presupposes could not exist. And of course, all these points that I just make are a little quirky and weird because I looked at the natural environment from the perspective of capitalist production. So I only ask, what does capitalist production need from the natural environment? And possibly you could think of other reasons why we would want to have conditions under which human life is possible. But I only looked at it from the perspective of capitalism here. You could of course also look at it the other way around and ask, well, what is capitalism doing to the natural environment? And so it's worthwhile looking at it in both directions. And I just have a small list of different kinds of ecological or environmental problems here, and I always briefly discuss whether these were caused by economic growth and whether these are problems for having a sustained economic growth. So one type of environmental problem many people think of is that we have a depletion or scarcity of resources. So if capitalism is all about economic growth, so we have ever more production, then we need ever more natural resources to some degree, and at some point resources will just deplete, so there is a limited supply of oil, and at some point we won't have any oil in the ground. And this is of course an effect of economic growth. However, does it mean that there is a limit on economic growth? I would say this is probably not the case in modernity or in capitalism, because here every kind of natural resource will probably be replaced by another type of resource. So if we run out of oil, we'll probably find other ways to drive our cars or to operate our machinery. So the loss of most specific resources can be overcome. Probably not when it comes to water and oxygen, but these will probably not deplete if we deal with pollution there. And this is, by the way, not only a problem of capitalism. We already had problems of depletion of resources with economic growth that was far before capitalism. So this is particularly true for deforestation. Most pre-capitalist civilizations, particularly those that took the form of empires, engaged in deforestation. So they chopped down all the trees in the areas, and then there weren't any trees anymore. So most of Italy and Greece were covered in forests 3,000 and 4,000 years ago. Now they are not. And why are they not? Because the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans chopped down all the trees for building, for fuel. So they depleted this natural resource right there. And the same is also true for ancient China, where we actually have desert right now in the place where the ancient Chinese civilization came from, because they chopped down all the trees. So it's always been a problem with economic growth, producing or leading to the depletion of some natural resources. But in many cases, this can be overcome by means of modern sciences and capitalism, because if we don't have enough of one resource, it will get more expensive, and then it will be worthwhile investing in alternatives to these resources, and investors will do this, and then these alternative resources will become cheaper at some point, and capitalist production can still work. Second problem we oftentimes think of when we think of the environment is the pollution of land, water, and air. And this is, of course, also produced by economic growth, and it's also not something that only came about once we had capitalism. So we had pollution also in ancient Rome and in other pre-capitalist civilization. However, of course, with modern industry and the exponential economic growth we had over the last 2 centuries, this escalated to a great degree. So, and many of these things are problems, and many of this causes massive human suffering. So the textbook talks about the Bhopal disaster, for example, where thousands lost their lives and hundreds of thousands of human beings became sick. And this is, of course, a huge problem. However, in general, I would say that the danger that the pollution of land, water, and air will simply cause a problem for our whole way of life, that we have to change our whole way of life and stop being capitalist. This is probably not the case. Pollution in general can be handled politically and then economically, and there can just be laws for that. And sometimes it takes a form that pollution is outsourced from the richer countries to the poorer countries, and this is a normative problem in itself and also an ecological problem, but it's nothing that will stop capitalism from going on if it is politically managed in some way. Then we have the related issue of land degradation or desertification, which has something to do with deforestation and with certain forms of agriculture. And this is also something that is caused by economic growth. Of course, economic growth is not the only cause of desertification. There have been deserts on planet Earth before there has been a human economy. However, certain forms of economic activities have accelerated desertification. And this is a problem, once again, particularly for the people living in the areas that face desertification. However, once again, I would say this is a problem that can be politically managed, and on a global scale, this will not mean that capitalism cannot continue. Next problem we might think of is the loss of biodiversity, meaning that certain species of plants and animals will go extinct. And this, of course, has been happening long before human beings were on this earth. However, with human beings shaping the earth, this led to a new massive wave of extinction of animals and plants. And this is also not something that began with capitalism. So if you look at the original expansion of humanity over the globe, this led to the mass extinctions of animals, particularly in Australia, New Zealand, in the Americas. So we had many big birds and mammals in all these continents and all these countries, and many of them went extinct shortly after the humans arrived and hunted them down or burned down forests, which human beings did also already when they were hunter-gatherers. So this is something that human beings contributed to massively. However, it also accelerated strongly with modernization and capitalism. So this is, of course, once again, a big normative problem. It is also a problem for human beings to some extent. However, does it challenge our whole way of life? I would say probably not. So if rhinoceroses go extinct, that's bad, but it won't harm capitalism. If we have too much fishing going on in the oceans, there might come a time when there are only very few fish left in the ocean. And this, of course, is a problem in many ways. It's also an economic problem, because then fishermen and fisherwomen won't have their jobs anymore, and the whole fishing industries will fall down. However, industries have been falling down all the time, and new industries were emerging, so this does not challenge capitalism as a whole. We probably have more jellyfish in the seas then, which will also make swimming there less enjoyable possibly. However, it does not really challenge our whole way of life mostly. Then we have one of the problems that we are in right now is that we have pandemics, which also come from the interaction of the natural environment and economic activities, because many diseases that cause pandemics are zoogenic, so they are present in animals and then jump over to humans, and this can happen all the time. It had happened long before modernity and capitalism. However, now we have conditions under which this is once again accelerated. And if you're thinking of the coronavirus pandemic we're in right now, you probably think of bats, and this is one scenario in which this can happen. However, most pandemics that we think of are influenza pandemics, and they don't come from bats. Rather, they come from chicken farming, so poultry farming or pig farming. And so we have these big amounts of animals that are to some extent related to human beings and which have viruses that can mix with human viruses. So this massive farming of poultry and pigs, this is typically where most pandemic viruses come from. And this is of course a capitalist enterprise because before capitalism we didn't have these massive farms. So this is a problem that also comes from economic growth. It also leads to problems for economic growth, but only temporarily. So it's rather improbable that we're going to face a pandemic that will make capitalism end. And now we come to the final problem, which is global warming, which is caused by the emission of greenhouse gases, mostly by carbon dioxide, but also by other greenhouse gases. This is definitely caused by industrialization or by human beings after the age of industrialization mostly. And this is of course caused by economic growth. And here I would say now we have a problem that's actually a problem that's not only caused by economic growth and by capitalism, but also that is a systemic threat to capitalism and to our entire growth-based way of life. And this is why I will focus on this one problem for the remainder of today's session. And once again, I want to emphasize this once more. This does not mean that I don't take the other issues seriously, or I think that all of these are non-issues. All of these are very important issues that have to be addressed, that have to be discussed, but I have limited time, so I will limit myself to the political economy of global warming right I'm not going to go into the science of global warming because hopefully most of you know the basics. I will just show you this one graph on the science of global warming, so to speak. So what you see here in black is the historical development of our emission of greenhouse gases. So you see they increased over the last 25 years, and they of course increased over the last 200 or 300 years, and this is what caused global warming. And now we have to think of ways in which we deal with it. And probably heard that we have different targets where we want to arrive at. So the almost realistic best case scenario that's still out there is the so-called 1.5 degree Celsius target, which means that the global climate will on average be 1.5 degrees warmer than it was in 1700. And in order to achieve this target, we'll have to strongly limit our output of greenhouse gas emission, and the extent to which we have to limit it you see there in the green line or the green shadowed area. Then we have the somewhat less ambitious 2 centigrade target, which is the same but only for 2 degrees warmer. You see that in yellow here. And in general, the idea is that if we have 1.5 degrees, it will already be bad for many human beings, but in general, we can probably still keep on existing on this planet the way we do. If we move up to 2 degrees, then it will be much worse for many more people. However, it's still something that's probably going to be bearable. If it moves over 2 degrees to 3 degrees, 4 degrees, then we probably have a massive amount of natural disasters, and this will be a challenge to human civilization and a whole way of life, to put it very mildly. And so the green line is where we should go with our emissions if we were to meet the 1.5 centigrade target. The yellow line is where we should go if we meet the 2 centigrade target. However, you also see those 2 blue lines. The darker blue line is, oh no, let's begin with the lighter blue line. The lighter blue line is the one where we would move if all countries in the world were reaching targets they pledged they would try to achieve. And then the darker blue line is where we are actually heading over the last couple of years. So you see that a couple of years ago in Paris, all or many national governments pledged that they will do better, that they will reduce their emissions or at least not increase their emissions as they did before. And as you see, that these targets were by far insufficient to even get near to the 2 or 1.5 centigrades, and even those targets are not reached right now. And what does this have to do with economic growth? You can get the first idea from these 2 graphs down here. So on the upper left side of the slide, you see the development of the world GDP over the last 300 years here. So it was quite almost flatlining over from in 1700 and even more before that, at least if you put it in relation to where we are today. And then it accelerated in the 1800s, even more in the 1900s, and then we have this exponential growth type of growth of the world GDP, which is the total economic output, so the total amount of all services and products that we create every year on this planet. On the bottom right hand side, you however see the annual total carbon emissions by world region. If you don't look at the different colors there, but only look at the uppermost line, then you see the global total of carbon emissions. And what you also see is that the pictures look very, very similar. So they are near zero until roughly 1850, then there is some linear growth until 1950, and then it's really exploding right here. So those two graphs are very, very similar, which means our whole economic growth over the last 150, 200 years is almost identical with the growth in our emission of greenhouse gases, which means that if we want to have this planet still habitable in 100 years, then we cannot keep with this mode of economic growth, at least. Before I go into the question what can be done about this, I just want to get rid of one idea right here, which you oftentimes hear, that change is in the hands of us as consumers. So we as consumers can just simply decide to consume ethically, to consume sustainably, and then all these problems can be overcome. You hear this when it comes to global warming. At the moment, you hear it when it comes to the production conditions in the meat industry, and it's always nonsense. So change will not come about by consumers making different decisions. I don't say it doesn't matter, it does matter. So if you try not to fly, if you try to eat vegan, if you try to use energy that's sustainable, I commend you for it. It's a good thing and it's an important thing, and it's an important contribution to tackling the issue of global warming. However, this is not how we can overcome this problem. And just two short points why we cannot overcome the problem this way. The first point is you as consumers cannot really control the conditions of production. So if you go to the supermarket or wherever you buy meat, if you do eat meat, then you can buy more expensive meat, but just buying more expensive meat doesn't mean that the workers in the factories work under good conditions. There is some connection between the two. So if the meat is really, really cheap, then you can be quite sure that the working conditions are really, really bad. However, if the meat costs more, it doesn't mean that the working conditions are any better. So it doesn't work this way. And similar with the global warming, you cannot control when you buy stuff how the energy is generated for the factory where the stuff is produced. This is not in your hand. You cannot decide this. There might be some niche markets where you have a guarantee by the vendor that this will be produced under sustainable circumstances. However, it's not really in your hand. Global warming is a collective and political challenge, and thusly it can only be overcome by collective and political action. Once again, I don't say that individual action is unimportant here. I just say this is not how you can overcome this problem. Because I just think if half of us decided to consume in a sustainable kind of way and live carbon neutral, I don't think we can do this as individuals, not even if we're half the population. And if we do this and the other half of the population continues to do as they do right now, this really gets us nowhere. It doesn't even get us near the 2-degree goal, because we have to reduce the whole carbon emission of the entire world economy to near zero levels over the next couple of decades and years. And so if half the population takes part and the other half does not, it gets us nowhere really. So this is a collective problem and we have to tackle it collectively, which means politically. So what can we do? I just distinguished three different pathways here. Of course, this is a very stylized distinction, and you can of course also think of certain combinations between three. So the first path is just business as usual. So we just continue as we operated over the last couple of centuries. We just have continued global GDP growth, and we have global continued growth in carbon emissions, and thusly we still see some economic prosperity over the next couple of years and decades, and maybe it will even mean that we can reduce poverty to some degree, and that many humans will have a better life in 10 and 15 and 20 years than they have right now. However, in 50 years, in 100 years, it means that the global living conditions on this planet deteriorate, and human life will not be possible in the way that it is right now, at least not for 8 or 10 or 12 billion people then. Second path is we draw the logical conclusion here and say, well, if our whole economic growth is always coupled with growth in carbon emissions, then we just have to engage in economic degrowth. So we have to restructure our whole economy in a way that it will not be based on economic growth anymore, while we still maintain adequate living conditions for roughly 8 billion people right now, probably a couple of billion more over the next couple of years. So we just not only discontinue growing, but actually we engage in shrinking our economy, because as you saw, we have to not just keep at the level of carbon emissions where we're at right now, we have to reduce it to near zero levels. The third pathway would say, well, historically we have seen that economic growth and carbon emissions are combined. However, this is no natural law, and our task is to decouple the two. So we want to have a growth in GDP while we also massively reduce carbon emissions or greenhouse gas emissions at the same time. So for the remainder of today's session, I will discuss these three approaches. With the first approach, we can make it really, really short. So the pros for this approach are mainly that it's very easy to achieve, because basically we don't have to change, and not changing is always the easiest thing to do. And to be honest, I would say this, or some variation of this, is probably the most likely scenario if you ask me. And if you really want to push it and make a good argument for this, then you could say, well, if we do this, then we can focus on other things. And this is also the argument that you mostly hear when it comes to policies on global warming. And those who say, well, we shouldn't take too strict policies there, they always argue that there is a conflict between different goals or targets. So if we put too much emphasis on countering global warming, then we have less political energy to invest in fighting poverty and to address other kinds of challenges. So this is the argument that you actually hear. However, the obvious downside is that the long-term outcome is not the most desirable one, to put it very, very politely. So now let's look at the second path. What can we say about degrowth? What can we say for degrowth? I once again show you those two graphs that I showed you before, and I show you instances of degrowth. Unfortunately, the data for the global GDP is not very good and very reliable for the time before 1950. So there you only have rough estimates, and you don't have that many data points there. So if you look at it closely, you see that there are only data points every decade or every couple of decades, or maybe even once a century only. So, but what we can really look at there are the last 50 years. And if you look at the last 50 years, you only find 1 year where you actually see a decline in the global GDP, and this is the Great Recession of 2009. And if you now look to the year 2009 on the bottom right diagram, then you see that we also have a decrease in greenhouse gas emissions at the same year. And this, of course, is not just a mere incident. It means that this has to do. In 2009, the industrial production declined overall in the world, so the need for energy declined, and thus we emitted less carbon dioxide in this time. And you can also find other instances where economic degrowth led to a decline in carbon emission. One of them was the fall of the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union, or then later Russia, is what you see in the bottom right-hand diagram at the orange section there, or at least part of it is Russia or the Soviet Union. And what you see right there is they were emitting a lot of greenhouse gases so roughly between 1960 and 1990. They emitted a lot and the emissions were growing, and then the emissions dropped rapidly. And this, of course, was because of the collapse of the Soviet Union and the collapse of most of socialism in Eastern Europe and Western and Northern Asia. And this was coupled with economic degrowth, to put it very politely. So the whole economy crashed, industrial production almost stopped in these regions, and this meant that carbon emission also declined. And then we also see other dents in global emissions. So we have World War II, and we also have the Great Depression. So the problem with this obviously is that all of these were human catastrophes. So all of these were times when you would not want to live. So those are certainly not models, and no proponent of degrowth says, well, let's live like we lived in the Great Depression. Let's live like we lived in Russia when the Soviet Union collapsed, because this meant that many people died. So the life expectancy in Russia dropped sharply after the fall of the Soviet Union. People fell into poverty. So this is not a model right here. However, what we still see is that a decline of the global GDP was coupled with a decline of greenhouse gas emission. And we can also see this right now. So I showed you the graph on the left side last week, and what you see there in the black line is the current world GDP, or the estimate of the current world GDP. What you see that at the end of 2019 it was somewhere at 102 points in this graph. Now it's somewhere at 94 points, so it declined roughly 8%. And now if we look at emissions for carbon over the last 6 months or so, we also see a decline. And of course these are all very rough estimates right here, but it might have declined between 10 and 20% globally. So once again, economic degrowth is coupled with a reduction of carbon emission, yet once again it's also coupled with massive human suffering. So many people get unemployed, and even many of those who don't get unemployed right now, because there are some programs by the governments that keep them employed despite of their companies not being profitable at the moment and not producing as much at the moment. Even those people would become unemployed and fall into poverty probably if this economic downturn did continue and there was no recovery, which there hopefully will be. Thus we have to not just take all these historic economic catastrophes as a model. We only take this as a proof for the idea that a reduction in GDP is historically correlated, or correlates strongly historically, with a reduction in carbon emissions. And if we want to have economic degrowth without having the human catastrophe that has always come with degrowth over the last couple of decades, this means that we have to find an entirely new way of organizing production, distribution, and consumption. Maybe not entirely new, but at least it cannot be capitalist, because capitalism needs economic growth, and there cannot be capitalism without economic growth. Thusly, there cannot be degrowth with capitalism. This then also means probably that the production, distribution, and consumption will have to be local and regional rather than global, because if we want to have global supply chains, it means that we have to have global transportation and global exchange of some forms, and all of this requires high amounts of energy, and it's probably very hard to generate these great amounts of energy without massive economic investment and growth. So if we want to replace all our energy usage that we currently generate from fossil fuels with solar energy, let's say, or wind energy. This means we have to invest massively, and massive investment, it does not really go very well with economic degrowth. And if we have a more localized and regional production, it also means that we probably have a harder time to produce high-tech kinds of goods, because this typically needs large scales of production, and this is easier conceivable under a globalized economy than in localized or regional economies. So probably if, let's say, Baden-Württemberg was autonomous, there probably wouldn't be a factory that produces Baden-Württembergian cell phones for every citizen there. So it's probably not gonna work this way. This then means that we have to get by with consuming far less, because that's what degrowth is about, that we produce less, and if we produce less, it also means that we can consume less. At least the average human being will have to consume less. Of course, there might be a more equal distribution, so the very poor might be able to consume even a little more than they do right now. If they have enough food, this will already be a plus. And on another plus side, it might also mean that we have to work far less, because we typically believe that right now, or the everyday human being typically believes that right now we're so technologically progressive that we have to work far less than human beings had back in the days. However, if you look at it historically, probably 10,000 years ago, humans worked far less than they do today. So maybe that's also a plus that we have there. However, I find it very doubtful that we find this kind of new degrowth economy that will be able to supply at least the bare necessities, so food, clothing, shelter, for 8 billion people, let alone 10 or 12 billion people that we probably have on this planet in a couple of decades. So of course you can then, on the other hand, argue that we're failing at this task anyway. So many millions die of hunger every single year. So you say, well, we're already failing at it, so how is this an argument against economic degrowth? My counter argument here would be, well, we're failing at supplying food for everyone. However, we are definitely producing enough food for the whole human population. It's just not that it reaches everyone. So I would say it's easier to change the current economic growth-based system in a way that everyone will get food than to organize this entirely new kind of economic system. Then the next problem will be that localized economies will be much more vulnerable to local crises such as droughts or natural disasters, because if we don't have these global supply chains and if we don't have global means of transportation, it will be harder to bring relief to populations affected by local events. However, it will, on the plus side, probably be less vulnerable to global crises. And finally, when we think of this not as something that is per se generally good, but as something that will also help overcoming global warming, I think it's very doubtful that this will work, because once again, we have to reduce the total global emissions to a near zero level over the next couple of decades. And this means that every country would have to take part in this kind of massive transformation of their life form, which means that we have to find something like a total global consensus right there. And if a couple of countries don't think this is attractive, which I find quite likely that they won't, then it will be very hard. And then we have, in addition to that, the problem that anarchists always traditionally used to have, because even if they were able to run their localized communities in a way that was good for them, it was always the case that they were less able to produce produce weaponry and organized militaries than their capitalist or socialist competitors, and so they typically then could not sustain their existence because they were forced into wars that they lost. So I wouldn't put my bets on degrowth, in short. So to fill up the table further, I would say the positive aspects here is that historically there actually has been a strong correlation between GDP growth and the growth in carbon emission. So this sounds like a very almost self-evident approach here. However, I'm not convinced by it economically that such a system of production can be produced to a degree that it will really help 8 billion people survive. And I find it politically very hard to conceive that there will be a majority, let alone a consensus or a mechanism of enforcement for this kind of model. Which finally leaves us with path number 3, which I dubbed green growth. And this is all about continuing economic growth while discontinuing the growth in carbon emissions. So how is this supposed to work? So once again, I show you these two diagrams, and now I want you to look at even different lines here. So please look at the development of the yellow area over the last 40 years or so. What you see here is the EU 28, so the current EU 27 plus the United Kingdom. And what you see there is that they were the major contributors to carbon emissions in the 1800s, and also were a major contributor in the first half of the 20th century. And they still engage in growing carbon emissions from 1950 to 1970, 1980s. However, ever since their carbon emission is stagnating or even declining. However, this does not mean their GDP is. So the GDP of all these countries is still growing. So they have somehow managed to continue their economic growth while limiting their carbon emissions. And something similar can be said for the United States. However, the graph is a little bit more tricky here because you cannot simply look at the top line of this bluish area, because the bottom line also changes. So it's not actually shrinking, but it's also not growing as fast as it did before. And if we look on a country level, we also find a lot of examples for countries that have managed to have a decline in greenhouse gas emission while still having a growth in the GDP. And here you see a list of 21 countries. I'm not going to go through every one of them. Some of them have very different stories that are behind these developments, but all these countries managed to have the economy grow with the greenhouse gas emission declining. However, what you see there is the best number that you have is the 30% decrease in carbon emissions for Denmark. And still remember, we have to reach a decline of 100% over the next couple of years or decades. So these are still baby steps that you see there. Another caveat here is that looking at the individual countries might also be misleading. And you can see this by looking at this diagram over here. So what do we see here? What we see here is a diagram of all the countries in the world and how their individual relation of greenhouse gas emission per GDP is. So what you see on the y-axis is how much carbon dioxide these countries emit annually. On the x-axis you see how their total economic output or their GDP is. So if the two were correlating perfectly and I don't know, $1,000 of GDP always equaled 1 ton of carbon dioxide emission, then you would have this once again as one straight line going up from the bottom right, where a very poor country emits very little carbon dioxide, to the upper left, where a very rich country emits a lot of carbon dioxide. And you kind of have an idea here where this line would be. However, you don't really see a line down there, rather you see an area. So, or it's like a fan there, so it fans out. So you have some countries that are very rich without emitting that much carbon dioxide. So you find there relatively, if you look at the bottom line, you find countries such as Panama, Malta, Switzerland, and Norway. They are at the bottom of this graph. So the lowest line when it comes to being rich without emitting too much. And then you have, at the upper hand, you have other countries that emit relatively much carbon dioxide for relatively little GDP. So you have the very big green dot there is China, but you also have oil producing countries such as Libya or Trinidad and Tobago, or a little bit differently also Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates. So they have to emit a lot of carbon dioxide per dollar, so to speak. However, it would be misleading to say, well, these countries at the top, they are the bad countries, they are not performing very well when it comes to environmental protection, and the countries at the bottom, they are just the good countries. Because part of this process is not just environmental protection, which is one part of it, it's also other mechanisms. So on the one hand, it means outsourcing production. So if certain European countries deindustrialized over the last 25 years and they relocated their industrial production to China, and now they consume products from China, this means that their own emission is declining, and now they can focus on the service industries or on other kinds of industries that don't emit that much carbon dioxide, while China creates all the carbon intensive manufacturing products. And so this does not really mean that these countries now do it better. It just means that there was a global relocation, and they are still part of this very same economic system. So if you look at the United Kingdom down there, which seems pretty good right here, however, their economy is highly financialized, which means the banking and finance sector contributes a lot to their GDP. And they, for example, manage investments in China, where industrial production takes place, by burning oil from Bahrain. And so it seems that the United Kingdom is very good and Bahrain and China are very bad. However, in the end, it's all part of the same system, so you cannot let the United Kingdom off the hook. However, this does not mean that environmental protection does not work and that that's not political. So if we look at this globally once more and look at it over time, then we can see that there has been some improvement. So what you see here is the ratio of carbon emission per GDP over time. So you just divide how many kilograms of carbon dioxide does the world emit per dollar of GDP that they earn, and there you see that this ratio almost halved, or even more than halved, over the last 25 years, or over the 25 years in this diagram. So there is some improvement in changing production. And this is my opportunity to challenge a sentence that you hear far too often, and that sounds very smart, but actually is not that smart. So the sentence always goes, how can we have an economy based on infinite economic growth in a world with finite resources? This economy can never work. And this sentence is false. It does not understand the logic of the economy of capitalism of economic growth in general. Because economic growth is measured in dollars or euros, and you can put 100 euros to very different usages. You can use 100 euros to buy a very inexpensive plane ticket and produce a lot of carbon emissions. You can also use $100 to buy some technological device that is manufactured in China and sent to you individually because you ordered it from a Chinese trading platform. That probably emits not as much carbon dioxide as your flight would, but still a lot. You could also use those 100 euros to get, I don't know, maybe a massage or 2 or 3. I don't know what massages cost actually, but you could do that. And that would probably not emit very much carbon dioxide. Well, depending on the weather, maybe they have to heat or air condition the place where the massage takes place. But other than that, you don't produce much emission there. You can also use these 100 euros to plant a tree or two, and then you even have a net negative carbon emission on it. And all of these would contribute $100 to the world GDP. And so you can have infinite economic growth without using ever more resources. So this is not a logical contradiction, even though it sounds like one. However, I don't mean that you as consumers have it in your hand. Once again, that's not what I'm saying. This is only an example here to say that dollars don't necessarily have to correlate to carbon emission. However, once again, we must say that we achieved something over here, but measured against what we have to achieve over the next years, that is something, but it's not perfect because remember, we have to go near zero over the next couple of years or decades. So of course, this red line here, this is just a fantasy line. Don't look at the numbers there. It's probably a little bit steeper than it should be, but we have to do even better because this linear decline will not really do, because remember, we still want to have exponential economic growth, so we have to have an even steeper decline in our ratio of carbon emissions per GDP. And how can we do this? I cannot and do not want to go into details here. I just want to show you this really cool graphic right here. I really love it. It's a great diagram, and I could go on talking about it for half an hour or even longer if I wanted to, but I'm not going to bother you with that. I encourage you, however, to just briefly pause the video maybe and look at the diagram because it's really, really interesting. Here I'm first only pointing at one fact, and this is that the majority of all our greenhouse gas emission comes from energy. So it's the entire orange reddish part at the top of the diagram, and this means energy in the sense of the fuel that we burn in cars. It means energy in the sense that we use to generate electricity or heating for our buildings, or that we need in the industry to produce stuff. And this, if you just combine the numbers there, is roughly 60% of the total global greenhouse gas emissions. So what do we have to do? We have to find energy sources that don't emit carbon dioxide. And this is not an actual suggestion. This is only another graphic to show you where the journey could be going. So what you see here is, of course, a world map in green. And then you see those tiny light greenish, yellowish squares there. And these squares are the areas on the world surface that you would have to cover in solar panels that are roughly as effective as it is plausible to fulfill the world's entire need for energy. And of course, we cannot simply do this just like that, but this just means that it is, in principle, technically possible to generate the energy for all economic and human needs without doing something that is entirely impossible, but we could just do this without emitting 1 single gram of carbon dioxide into the air. However, you should not think of this only as a technical problem. So it's not only something where we have to wait until the engineers and physicists have figured it out, how we build these solar plants or how we make nuclear fusion work. What we much rather have to do, we also have to see this as an economic problem or a question of massive economic investment. And these economic investments are not profitable at the moment. So at the moment, it's smarter to invest in drilling oil or fracking oil than it is to invest in these kinds of massive solar energy production facilities that we would need. However, technically it would be possible. So, and if we just think about it, this means that we could just cross out these entire 60% of our carbon emissions if we were to invest enough in renewable energy sources. Then we can also say, well, 18% of the carbon emission comes from mainly from deforestation, and we can simply stop deforestation and maybe even plant a few more trees at the margins of deserts. So maybe we even get a negative carbon balance there. And then we could also simply stop using cattle farming, and then we already reduced the carbon emissions by 85%, and that's somewhere where we would have to get to reach the 2% or 1.5% goals. So what does this need for green growth as a bottom line? First, it means that we have to invest massively in energy efficiency. So maybe we can also create industries that don't use as much energies, but also in carbon neutral sources of energy, such as solar or wind energy or water energy. We also have to stop using fossil fuels, which goes together with the first, but we also have to stop burning wood. Then we probably have to stop some other harmful human activities, such as deforestation and probably also cattle farming, because you know the whole story about the cows burping methane gas, which you cannot stop them from doing. So we probably have to limit this. And then we probably also have to limit some energy intensive activities such as air traffic and car traffic for some time. At some point in the future, when we have clean carbon neutral forms of energy, it might even be that we can all fly in planes and drive SUVs without a guilty conscience. However, until then, we probably have to limit this, and possibly limiting the car traffic might be beneficial anyway, at least in the bigger cities. Then it's also the case that for this, once again, all countries in the world would have to participate in these efforts, and this means the so-called developed countries as well as the so-called developing countries. And this, of course, has to be managed in a way that's historically and globally fair, so to speak. So it would be a lot to ask for everyone to just stop their economic growth right now, because the Europeans and the North Americans and the Japanese have historically produced by far the majority of greenhouse gas emissions. And now, as a country in Africa, you can argue, well, why should we not grow right now? Because you emitted all this carbon dioxide. Now we cannot stop our economic growth because of that. So, and solar energy might be too expensive there, so you cannot expect the poorer countries to carry all the burden. So there has to be some mechanism of to create this fairly. And then we have also some other dynamics that are problematic, that are inherent to our current political and economic system. So we have certain economic dynamics that undermine this whole effort. And we could mainly dub this as consumerism or as part of consumerism. For example, we all know and everyone knows that the cars are a major contributor to global warming. However, if we look at the numbers of cars that are sold are always increasing, and the size of the cars that are sold are also always increasing. Because for most individuals, it's just a thing of, well, I really need this car to get to work, and if I want to get to work, I want a nice car, and I kind of have the money right here, so I buy this, and this is also, of course, incentivized by advertising, and so there is this whole dynamic, and then the producers are more than happy to produce these ever bigger cars, and these are dynamics that make it very, very hard to reach these green growth kind of thing. And then we also have political dynamics, which can be maybe boiled down to lobbying by special interest groups. So far, most political initiatives to overcome global warming or attack global warming were always attacked by big energy lobbying, so particularly by the oil industries. They of course have a lot of money at disposal, and this money can buy political influence to water down all political initiatives that we have right here. And these are real big challenges, because we all know that this problem exists for decades, yet all that have been done so far is by far insufficient. So what could this green growth look like more concretely? You can roughly distinguish 3 different sub-paths, so to speak. The first, path 3A, would be the pro-market approach. These authors would argue that what we see here is some sort of market failure that stems from the fact that the participants in the market do not have to pay for the costs they produce for society or for humanity. So everyone who emits carbon dioxide into the atmosphere produces costs over the next couple of decades or centuries or millennia. However, you don't have to pay for lighting a fire somewhere. You don't have to pay directly for burning gasoline in the car or whatever, at least not in every country. So the argument here goes that we have to actually charge everyone who's emitting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere for this activity, and this will then incentivize emitting less carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and this will also create a change in what kind of investments are profitable. So if boiling oil becomes much more expensive because you have to pay for the carbon emissions, then it means that many will look for different sources of energy, and this means that maybe solar energy or wind energy that were not as profitable as oil before become more profitable, and maybe fracking becomes unprofitable. So the idea here is to create incentives by the state to make sure that the market forces then create green growth, and among these are carbon pricing or emission trading, which both are different systems that are more concretely described in the textbook, that try to make sure that emitting carbon costs you money, and this will then solve the problem and be a pathway to green growth. Secondly, we can also look at something that we might call green Keynesianism. Here the idea is that the state must do much more than was described before, because all this that was described before would maybe work too slowly or would be politically unfeasible. And so what's the argument here is that the state itself must directly undertake the necessary investment and intervene into the market to enable green growth. So it's not that we put a price tag on carbon emissions and then wait for the market forces to make oil more expensive, and then wait for the market forces to discover that building big solar plants and wind power plants is profitable and then build these plants. Rather, the state directly says, well, we now build these power plants over here and over here, maybe in joint ventures with private companies, but the state is actively involved there. The state actively maybe prohibits the use of fossil fuels, and so the state has a much more active role right here. However, this does not mean we have socialism, because there are still private enterprises, and in this whole framework then the magic of the market can work under new circumstances, and then the market will still create mass welfare, but in a sustainable kind of fashion. And this is the category where I put all this talk about the Green New Deal that we get from the United States in the last couple of years. You probably heard this kind of a deal, mainly pushed by AOC and other parts of the left wing of the Democratic Party. They want to have massive state investment in renewable energies, thereby creating jobs, creating welfare, creating economic growth, of course, while also becoming ecologically sustainable. You see a somewhat different version in the European Union's Green Deal that has been pushed forward by the von der Leyen Commission over the last couple of months. It's not as strongly left-leaning, but you could also categorize it as green Keynesianism here. And finally, you could also think of a green socialism, where you say, well, this all won't work as long as private entrepreneurs have the means of production in their hand, because they don't take this seriously. So we have to socialize the means of production in order to overcome all these political and economic resistances that we have against green growth, because once that no private companies have oil producing facilities, they also still then they cannot put political lobbying resistance against green growth. So let's come back to the big table. Now we can say that the upside of the green growth approach is that GDP growth and emission reduction can be combined, and we see examples that this correlation between GDP growth and carbon emission is not necessary. And I would argue that this is probably the best and most realistic chance there is, despite not being really confident that this is what's going to happen. However, the downside are that we have immense economic and political resistances to it, and I think it's quite doubtful that we will actually reach the target in time this way, so I'm not too optimistic here. And finally, you can of course also think of certain combination of these approaches, and what we have right now actually is sort of the a combination of the approaches. So we have quite a bit of business as usual that is combined with certain elements of green growth. However, this kind of combination probably leads us nowhere. You could also think of a combination maybe of green socialism, so past 3C, and certain versions of degrowth, which might then also become more realistic than this caricature of degrowth that I painted before. However, none of this is gonna be easy, but the bottom line here is that we can have economic growth and mass welfare without emitting ever more carbon dioxide. We just have to politically want it, and we have to organize political majorities for it in order to do it. Okay, that's it for today. See you next week for the final session of our lecture. Goodbye.